June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force in human history, crashed across the Soviet border. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft drove eastward with the confidence of conquerors. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 27 days, France in 46. Now they would break the Soviet Union in, Hitler promised, just 8 weeks. German Panzer crews rolled forward in their Panzer III's and IV's, the finest tanks in Europe. They'd proven it in France. They'd proven it in the Balkans. Their 50mm guns could penetrate any Allied armor. Their crews were veterans, tactically superior, racially supreme, or so they'd been told. Then, on a dusty road near Rzyniai in Lithuania, everything changed. A German anti-tank gun crew spotted a Soviet tank rolling toward them. Not one of those pathetic BT-7 light tanks they'd been destroying all morning. Something bigger, squatter, angular in a way that looked wrong, crude, unrefined. The kind of thing you'd expect from Slavic workers who, according to German propaganda, barely knew how to hold a wrench. The Germans called it the Mouse, a dismissive nickname for what appeared to be a primitive, unsophisticated design. The Pak 36 anti-tank gun, the standard German tank killer, opened fire at 50 meters. Direct hit. The shell bounced off. They fired again and again. 5 direct hits. 5 ricochets, sparking off into the Russian countryside like stones skipped across water. The tank kept coming. Then its turret traversed. A 76.2mm gun, massive by 1941 standards, locked onto the German position. One shot. The Pak 36 crew ceased to exist, along with their gun, their confidence, and everything they'd been told about Soviet inferiority. Within hours, reports flooded back to German command. Shells bouncing off like peas. Tanks absorbing dozens of hits. Crews abandoning their positions in terror as unstoppable Soviet armor rolled over German positions like they weren't even there. One German officer wrote in his combat diary, "Our companies opened fire at about 700 to 800 meters. The tanks came steadily on. Soon we were facing them at 50 to 100 meters. A fantastic exchange of fire took place without any visible German success. The Russian tanks continued to advance and all armor-piercing shells simply bounced off them." This was the T-34, and in the summer of 1941, it made every German tank obsolete overnight. This is the story of how a mouse became a monster, how Soviet engineering genius defeated Nazi tactical brilliance, how one tank design forced Germany to redesign its entire armor doctrine, and how 84,000 steel beasts, more than any other tank in history, proved that revolutionary design combined with ruthless mass production could bury the Third Reich under an avalanche of superior steel. To understand how the T-34 shocked the Wehrmacht, we need to go back to 1937, to a design bureau in Kharkov, Ukraine, and to a man named Mikhail Koshkin. Koshkin was not your stereotypical Soviet engineer. He was methodical, obsessive, and willing to challenge conventional wisdom. Dangerous traits in Stalin's USSR, where disagreeing with authority could earn you a bullet. But Koshkin had a vision that would change tank warfare forever. The problem was simple: armor versus weight. Want better protection? Add thicker armor. But thicker armor means heavier tanks. Heavier tanks need bigger engines. Bigger engines need more fuel. More fuel means even more weight. It's a vicious cycle that had constrained tank design since World War I. Every nation solved this the same way: make the armor thicker and accept the weight penalty. French tanks were slow but heavily armored. German tanks were faster but more lightly protected. British tanks tried to split the difference. Everyone was trapped in the same paradigm. Koshkin asked a different question. What if we don't need thicker armor? What if we need smarter armor? The answer was geometry. Imagine shooting a bullet at a wall. Straight on, it penetrates. Now tilt that wall 60 degrees. The bullet has to travel through more material to penetrate, even though the wall itself isn't any thicker. The effective thickness doubles. Triple if you do it right. This wasn't new science. Naval architects had understood it for decades. But tank designers had always prioritized internal space, crew comfort, and ease of manufacture over geometric efficiency. Vertical armor was simpler to build. Sloped armor was complicated, reduced internal volume, and made production more difficult. Koshkin didn't care about simple, he cared about survival. His design called for armor sloped at 60 degrees on the glacis, the front plate. This meant 45 millimeters of actual armor provided the equivalent protection of 90 millimeters of vertical armor. Overnight, the T-34 became twice as hard to penetrate without gaining a single kilogram. But the Soviet military establishment resisted. Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, Stalin's crony overseeing tank development, favored multi-turreted heavy tanks, lumbering fortresses that looked impressive in Red Square parades. The T-34, with its single turret and unconventional design, didn't fit the doctrine. Koshkin had to prove his tank worked. In March 1940, with his design still facing bureaucratic resistance, he did something audacious. He drove two T-34 prototypes from Kharkov to Moscow, over 750 kilometers through the brutal Russian spring thaw, the season called Rasputitsa, when roads become rivers of mud. No paved highways, no support vehicles, just two tanks, their crews, and Koshkin's determination to show that his design could handle the nightmarish conditions of the Eastern Front. They made it, barely. The demonstration convinced Stalin. The T-34 entered production in September 1940. Koshkin never saw his creation dominate the battlefield. The Moscow journey, driven through snow and mud, destroyed his health. He contracted pneumonia and died in September 1940, at age 42, just as the first production T-34s rolled off assembly lines. But his legacy would bury the Wehrmacht. Let's talk about why the T-34 was revolutionary, because it wasn't just the sloped armor. It was a perfect storm of innovations that, combined, created something the Germans couldn't match in 1941. The armor, the sloped glacis, was the headline feature, but the entire tank employed angled surfaces. The turret was rounded, not the squared-off designs Germans used. Shells that hit at an angle were far more likely to ricochet than penetrate. German crews reported shooting T-34s from the side only to watch shells bounce off into the sky. The armor itself was 45 millimeters on the front glacis and turret, 40 millimeters on the sides. By comparison, the Panzer III, Germany's main battle tank in 1941, had 30 millimeters of vertical armor on the front. The Panzer IV had 50 millimeters, but it was vertical, making it far less effective. The gun. The T-34 mounted a 76.2 millimeters L-11 gun, later upgraded to the superior F-34 model. This was massive for 1941. German tanks mounted 37 millimeters or 50 millimeters guns. The Panzer IV had a 75 millimeters, but it was a low-velocity gun designed for infantry support, not tank killing. The T-34's gun could penetrate 69 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. In 1941, there wasn't a German tank that could withstand that. The Panzer III, 30 millimeters armor, dead. Panzer IV, 50 millimeters, dead. Even the rare Panzer IVs with face-hardened armor couldn't survive a frontal hit. Meanwhile, German 37mm and 50mm guns struggled to penetrate the T-34 from any angle except the rear or at point-blank range. The standard Pak 36 anti-tank gun, the backbone of German anti-tank defense, was so useless against T-34s that German troops nicknamed it the door knocker. Could knock, but it couldn't come in. The engine. The T-34 ran on a V12 diesel engine producing 500 horsepower. Diesel had massive advantages. It didn't catch fire as easily as gasoline, it was more fuel efficient, and Soviet refineries could produce it in vast quantities. This gave the T-34 a top speed of 53 kilometers per hour on roads, faster than the Panzer III's 40 kilometers per hour or the Panzer IV's 38 kilometers per hour. In an era where tanks still moved slower than horses, 10 to 15 kilometers per hour was a decisive advantage. It meant Soviet tanks could choose their engagements, flank German positions, or retreat before being surrounded. The suspension. Koshkin used a Christie suspension system, large road wheels with coil springs. This gave the T-34 exceptional off-road mobility. It could traverse terrain that would immobilize German tanks, whose narrow tracks sank into mud and snow. T-34's wide tracks, 640mm compared to the Panzer III's 380mm. Distributed weight over a larger surface area. This reduced ground pressure, preventing the tank from getting bogged down in the Russian Rasputitsa or winter snow. German tanks, designed for the paved roads of Western Europe, were engineering marvels of precision, narrow tracks, complex transmissions, intricate suspension systems. They were beautiful machines. They were also death traps in Russia. The T-34 sat low, just 2.4 meters tall compared to the Panzer IV's 2.68 meters. In tank warfare, a lower profile means you're harder to spot and harder to hit. The T-34 could hide behind terrain features where German tanks would be exposed. The production philosophy. Here's where Soviet genius truly showed. The T-34 was designed for mass production in a way German tanks never were. German tanks were over-engineered. They had complex gearboxes, precision machined parts, and required skilled labor to build. The Panzer IV's transmission alone was a masterpiece of German engineering. 5 forward gears, intricate synchromesh, smooth as butter. The T-34's transmission was crude, difficult to shift, and required brute strength to operate. Soviet tankers joked that you needed a sledgehammer to change gears, but it could be built by unskilled workers in factories without precision tooling. When the Germans invaded, Soviet factories were evacuated east of the Ural Mountains and rebuilt from scratch. Workers who'd never seen a lathe were producing T-34s within months. The sloped armor, despite being harder to manufacture, actually required less steel than equivalent protection using vertical armor. Less steel meant more tanks from the same resources. Every design choice prioritized survivability and producibility over crew comfort or mechanical refinement. The T-34 was uncomfortable, loud, and had terrible visibility. Its two-man turret, commander and gunner, meant the commander had to load shells, aim, fire, command the tank, and maintain situational awareness simultaneously. An impossible workload that reduced combat effectiveness. German tanks had three-man turrets with dedicated loaders, better optics, and superior visibility. In a one-on-one engagement with equally trained crews, a Panzer IV might win. July 1941. The German advance was unstoppable. Panzer spearheads knifed hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Millions of Red Army soldiers were encircled, captured, or killed. Victory seemed inevitable. Then the T-34s appeared. At first, there weren't many. Soviet production was still ramping up, and many were lost to mechanical failures, poor crew training, or being abandoned during chaotic retreats. But every encounter left German crews shaken. A Panzer commander named Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma wrote, "The Russian tanks have guns more powerful than ours and heavier armor. We can hardly make any impression on them. We find that the Russian tanks swallow our anti-tank shot like bread." Another report from the 4th Panzer Division stated, a tank commander reported that his tank and another tank fired on a T-34 from 40 meters. The shells did not penetrate. The T-34 turned around and destroyed both tanks. Think about that. 40 meters. You could throw a rock that far. German 50mm guns, supposedly capable of penetrating most Allied tanks, bounced off Soviet armor at distances where you could see the rivets. The psychological impact was devastating. German panzer crews had rolled through Europe with virtual impunity. French tanks were slow and poorly coordinated. British tanks were mechanically unreliable. Now they faced an enemy whose armor they couldn't penetrate, whose guns could destroy them from distances they couldn't fight back from, and who kept coming no matter how many times you hit them. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine and commander of Panzer Group II, admitted, "The Russian T-34 was the best tank in the world in 1941. Coming from Guderian, a man not known for praising enemies, this was an astonishing admission. The Germans tried everything. 8.8 centimeters flak guns. The famous 88 anti-aircraft gun became the primary counter to T-34's. Could penetrate the T-34's armor at range, but it was huge, heavy, difficult to conceal, and required a large crew. Using anti-aircraft guns to fight tanks was an admission of failure. Close-range tactics. German doctrine evolved to ambush T-34s at point-blank range, aiming for the thinner required suicidal courage. Getting close enough meant exposing yourself to the T-34's devastating 76.2mm gun. Explosive charges. Infantry attacks with magnetic mines, satchel charges, and Molotov cocktails became common. Effective, but infantry approaching a T-34 had a low survival rate, especially if the tank had infantry support. New weapons. Germany accelerated development of the 75mm Pak 40 anti-tank gun and began upgunning Panzer IVs with longer 75mm guns. These helped, but wouldn't arrive in significant numbers until 1942. The most telling response came in November 1941, when a German commission was sent to the Eastern Front specifically to study the T-34. Their report recommended Germany simply copy the design. Not adapt it, not improve it. Copy it wholesale: engine, suspension, sloped armor, everything. This recommendation was rejected as beneath German engineering pride, but the panic it represented was real. The master race was being beaten by primitive Slavs using superior technology. But here's the reality. Despite its technical superiority, the T-34 didn't win the war in 1941. In fact, Soviet tank forces were decimated. Why? Because tanks don't fight alone. They fight as part of combined arms forces with infantry, artillery, air support, logistics, and most critically, trained crews and competent commanders. The Soviets had none of this in 1941. Stalin's purges in 1937 to 38 had executed or imprisoned most of the Red Army's experienced officers. The men commanding T-34's in 1941 were often inexperienced junior officers promoted beyond their competence. Crews received minimal training, sometimes as little as 2 weeks. Radio communication was poor. Many tanks lacked radios entirely. Soviet tactics were rigid and predictable. Tank crews were ordered to charge directly at German positions, where they'd be destroyed by anti-tank guns, artillery, and airstrikes. The two-man turret meant commanders were overwhelmed with tasks, unable to maintain situational awareness. Poor visibility meant T-34's often couldn't see threats until too late. Logistics were catastrophic. T-34's broke down constantly. Early models had transmission problems, clutch failures, and air filter issues that clogged in dusty conditions. When they broke, there were no spare parts, no recovery vehicles, and no repair capacity. Tanks were abandoned wholesale. In the first 6 months of Barbarossa, the Soviets lost approximately 20,000 tanks, including thousands of T-34's. Most weren't destroyed in combat. They were abandoned due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or during chaotic retreats. The Germans studied every captured T-34. They found the design brilliant, but the execution flawed. Welds were crude. Finish was rough. Quality control was inconsistent. Some T-34's had excellent armor. Others had defects that allowed shells to penetrate more easily. But here's what the Germans missed. None of that mattered. Soviet factories were learning. Crews were learning. Commanders were learning. And most importantly, production was accelerating. By late 1941, Soviet factories evacuated to the Urals were producing T-34's in astonishing numbers. The Kharkov factory alone, now relocated to Nizhny Tagil, could produce 25 tanks per day. Workers lived in barracks, worked 12-hour shifts, and slept beside assembly lines. The T-34 was refined. The F-34 gun replaced the L-11, improving armor penetration. Transmissions were improved. Air filters were redesigned. Production techniques were streamlined. Some tanks rolled off assembly lines without interior paint. Who cares if the crew compartment is pretty? And Soviet tactics evolved. Tank corps were reorganized with better combined arms coordination. Radios became standard. Crew training improved, not to German standards, but better than the chaos of 1941. By 1942, the tide was beginning to turn. The German response to the T-34 was everything you'd expect from a nation that valued engineering excellence over pragmatic mass production. They built better tanks. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, was a monster 56 tons, 88mm gun, armor up to 120mm thick. It could destroy a T-34 from 2 kilometers away while being nearly invulnerable to the T-34's 76.2mm gun from the front. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was Germany's direct answer to the T-34. Sloped armor? Finally. Powerful 75mm long-barreled gun? Excellent optics. Many historians consider it the best tank of World War II from a purely technical standpoint. These tanks were phenomenal. In the right hands, they were devastating. At the Battle of Koshkin in July 1943, individual Tiger and Panther tanks achieved staggering kill ratios. But Germany produced 1,347 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. The Soviets produced 84,000 T-34's. Here's the fundamental problem the Germans couldn't solve: over-engineering. A Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to build. A T-34 required 3,000. Yes, the Tiger was 10 times better in combat, but it wasn't 30 times better, which is what it needed to be to justify the production cost. Tigers and Panthers were mechanically complex, requiring frequent maintenance by skilled technicians using precision parts. When they broke down, which was often, they needed specialized recovery vehicles to retrieve them. If one was disabled in combat, it often had to be destroyed to prevent capture because Germany lacked the resources to recover it. T-34's broke down too, but they were simple enough that field repairs were possible. And if one was lost, the Soviets built 3 more that week. This is the essence of Soviet design philosophy. Quantity has a quality all its own. By 1943, German Panzer divisions were mixing Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and captured Soviet tanks because they couldn't produce enough of any single model. Logistics became a nightmare. Different ammunition, different spare parts, different maintenance requirements. Soviet Tank Corps, by contrast, were standardized T-34's, and more T-34's. Every crew trained on the same tank. Every repair depot stocked the same parts. Every ammunition truck carried the same shells. The Germans built better tanks. The Soviets built more tanks. And in total war, more wins. Let's talk numbers, because numbers tell the story of the T-34's impact. 84,000 T-34's were produced during World War II, variants included. This is the most produced tank in history. Approximately 44,900 were destroyed in combat. An 82% loss rate. Think about that. The Soviets lost 4 out of every 5 T-34's they built and still won. German tank production for the entire war? Approximately 25,000 tanks of all types combined, Panzer III's, IVs, Tigers, Panthers, everything. The Soviets outproduced them more than 3 to 1 in a single tank model. Here's a staggering comparison. The combined weight of all T-34's built during World War II equals approximately 1.75 million tons. The total weight of bombs dropped on Germany by Allied strategic bombing from 1939 to 1945? 1.5 million tons. The T-34 program, by sheer mass, represented more destructive power than the entire Allied bombing campaign. By 1945, Soviet tank armies were rolling across Eastern Europe in unstoppable waves. German forces, by then equipped with some of the best tanks ever designed, were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every Panther or Tiger that destroyed 3 T-34's, 5 more T-34's appeared behind them. German Panzer Commander Otto Carius, one of the most successful tank aces in history, said, "The problem with the Russians wasn't the quality of their tanks, although the T-34 was very good. The problem was that you could destroy 10 of them, and 20 more would appear." The T-34 forced Germany into an unwinnable arms race. Every improvement the Germans made, better armor, bigger guns, more powerful engines, required more resources, more production time, and more complexity. The final irony? The T-34 that shocked the Wehrmacht in 1941 was still effective in 1945. Yes, the T-34-85 variant with the upgraded 85mm gun was superior, but even original T-34-76S remained in service until the end. No German tank from 1941 could make that claim. The Panzer III was obsolete by 1942. The early Panzer IV variants were inadequate by 1943. Germany was forced into a constant cycle of redesign, rework, and refinement, squandering resources on complexity while the Soviets refined a winning formula and built it 84,000 times. The story of the T-34 is the story of how one brilliant design, Sloped armor, powerful gun, wide tracks, diesel engine, and mass production changed the course of history. It's the story of how Mikhail Koshkin's geometric insight, that angled armor was smarter than thick armor, gave the Soviet Union a decisive advantage when they needed it most. It's the story of how German engineering excellence, tactical brilliance, and individual superiority couldn't overcome Soviet industrial might and pragmatic design. The Germans called it the Mouse, a dismissive nickname for what looked like crude, primitive engineering. But that mouse became the most feared predator on the Eastern Front. That mouse forced the Wehrmacht to redesign its entire armor doctrine. That mouse buried German Panzer divisions under an avalanche of superior steel. 84,000 T-34's rolled off Soviet assembly lines. 44,000 were destroyed. And the Soviets won anyway because they understood something the Germans never did. In total war, perfection is the enemy of enough. The T-34 wasn't perfect. It was uncomfortable, difficult to operate, and had serious ergonomic flaws. But it was good enough, and there were enough of them. When the last shots of World War II were fired, T-34s sat in Berlin, while German Tigers and Panthers were smoking wrecks scattered across 1,000 kilometers of retreat. The mouse had roared, and the Reich had fallen. This is the legacy of the T-34, proof that revolutionary thinking, geometric genius, and industrial ruthlessness could overcome tactical perfection. Proof that sloped armor, a simple geometric principle, could make panzers obsolete overnight. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson in the summer of 1941, when shells bounced off Soviet steel and German confidence shattered like glass. They just learned it too late.